My name is Matt Hart. I'm the chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, where I had the pleasure with working with our star turn tonight, Rachel Adams. My job is pleasantly simple, which is to introduce the speakers and then to moderate the Q&A. And then our program is equally simple. Following my introductions, Rachel will offer a short introduction to her book. After Rachel, we'll hear responses to the book from our panelists in the order in which we are sitting. I'm at the end. I'm not a respondent. You won't hear from me after this. And then we'll have questions and answers with the audience at the end. So I'm going to begin by introducing the respondents in the order that they speak, and then I'll hand off to Rachel to begin. So I'm delighted to say that at the start of this academic year, C. Riley Snorton is now a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, where he also holds an appointment in the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender. A distinguished cultural theorist who focuses on racial, sexual, and transgender histories and cultural productions, Riley is the author of Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, Minnesota 2014, and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, Minnesota 2017, the latter of which won a truly absurd number of prizes, including the John Boswell Prize from the American Historical Association and the William Sanders Scarborough Prize from the MLA. In addition to these honors, since 2020, Riley has been co-editor of GLQ, a journal of gay and lesbian studies, one of the foundational journals in the field. And Riley's working on a number of current projects, among which I'm particularly excited about the Hortense Spillers reader that Riley's co-editing with Vanderbilt University Press. Amy Hsu is assistant professor of sociology at Barnard College, where her research and teaching focuses include healthcare, inequality, race and ethnicity, development, and science and technology studies. Like Rachel, she is a product of the great University of California system, having come to Barnard from UCLA and the UC San Diego Institute for Practical Ethics. Professor Hsu has published widely on public health and health inequalities in the US and beyond, with a particular focus on the COVID-19 and HIV pandemics. Her book project asks how global health efforts to address the HIV epidemic reconfigure local healthcare institutions, with a particular focus on healthcare providers and patients in Malawi. Our final respondent today is Laura Maudlin, Associate Professor of Social and Critical Inquiry at the University of Connecticut, where she works on the impact of ableist practices on practices and beliefs, on people's everyday lives, or as she puts it, on how it seeps into our most intimate spaces, like how we feel about who we are, our sense of self-worth, and our relationships. Among much else, Professor Maudlin is the author of Made to Hear, Cochlear Implants and Raising Deaf Children, which won an honorable mention from the American Sociological Association, and she's co-editor of the volume Disability in the Time of the Pandemic. But perhaps the thing that makes her most appropriate as a respondent beyond her expertise in disability studies for today's session is her forthcoming book, In Sickness and in Health, which is out in spring 26 from Echo HarperCollins. And in that book, Professor Maudlin draws on scholarly research, interviews with ordinary people, and her own intimate experience to ask what happens to love when we ask it to do the work of an entire broken healthcare system. Which leads me to the reason we're here today, to care, and to my dear colleague, Rachel Adams. It's appropriate that we're here to discuss Rachel's scholarship on care because, and here's the predictable segue, there are a few more caring members of our department, few colleagues on whom so many of us has depended so often and so regularly. And that is all true. Rachel was the first colleague to take me out from lunch after my arrival here at Columbia in 2010, just to give one tiny example. But I'm not here to praise Rachel the carer or Rachel the excellent colleague. I'm here to introduce Professor Rachel Adams, the scholar and the writer, the author of 4 books and co-editor of 2 more, including a foundational masculinity studies reader from 2001 and Keywords for Disability Studies, a 2015 volume that marked the decisive emergence of disability studies as a major interdisciplinary field. Rachel's books include 2 academic monographs in American studies, the field in which she trained in one of the several areas, including disability studies, film, feminism and gender studies, and food studies, in which she teaches and advises students. But as you know, the writer Rachel Adams encompasses more than even Professor Rachel Adams. For in addition to her academic work, Rachel is the memoirist of Raising Henry, a searingly beautiful account of the first 3 years of her son Henry's life, which means also a crucial 3 years in her own life and her husband's and her elder sons and in the lives of everyone who loves and cares for Henry and his people. As the parent of a child with a developmental disability myself, I cannot tell you how much Rachel's honesty about parenting has meant to me. Just one example of the honesty of her insights and the insights allowed by that honesty. There's a moment early in Raising Henry when Rachel wonders to her own amusement, knowing exactly how it sounds, whether she had written a book about freaks, this is her first book, Sideshow USA, as unconscious preparation for the work of raising a disabled child. As I read Love, Money, Duty over the past week, I thought several times that this book represents the perfect distillation of the immediacy and integrity, the honesty and the candor, even the difficult honesty of Raising Henry, with the sprawling argumentative intelligence of one of Rachel's scholarly books, such as Continental Divides, and all of that buttressed by a kind of sincerity and candor that I think underwrites all of her work, whether written for a popular audience or for scholars and students. As you'll discover today, Love, Money, Duty is a wonderful book, the product of a scholar, critic, and public thinker in full command of her style and of her subject matter. It is an honor to introduce Rachel Adams. And Rachel, I've been asked to remind you to press the button.
Okay, how's that? Oh, I sound very loud and I'm very humbled. Matt, thank you so much for that introduction. And to this whole panel of speakers who come from many different corners of my life, but they're all people that I have longed to have as interlocutors. And so I'm just so delighted to have them here. And I appreciate the work they put into spending time with my work. I also want to thank Lindsay Schramm for just the hard and much appreciated effort of putting this event together. The last time I wrote a book, we didn't yet have these events, and I have been in the audience, and a couple times I've been a commentator for so many of these over the years, and I've always wish that I could finish my own book so that it could be the subject of such an event. So I am just delighted to be here. I'm a little bit nervous because, as Matt said, the book came out in the spring and I'm not sure how much I remember, but I'm going to do my best just to recall what I've done and talk about it. So, Matt, thank you for those beautiful words about my memoir. I have, since people have asked me to talk about where my new book came from, I've started to think about the two books as sort of like a 2-volume study. And maybe in the way I wrote about freaks so I could prepare myself for Henry. And then I wrote a memoir about the early years in my son's life, my son with Down syndrome. And then as I continued to think about what I was going to do next, I kept continually returning to the problems of care, the work that I was doing and the broader frameworks that surrounded it. And I realized that that was where I wanted to put my scholarly energy, into thinking about its complex meanings, its locations, its representations. And so that led me to the book that we're talking about today. And in the book, also following from the earlier work that I did, I just want to be clear about its focus, because care can mean so very many things, and it's a term that's really exploded into different critical conversations since I started doing this work. So I focus specifically on the kind of care that dependent persons need and are unable to provide for themselves and the people who supply it. So the book starts with an introduction, and I do tell some stories. I lay out some theories. I give some history for the problems of care that I write about in the book. And then the book consists of both a series of reading. So I see myself as sort of a collector of other people's stories of care. I'm not a social scientist, so these are print stories. There's stories in various kinds of media. But I start with the most intimate relation of mother and child, and then I expand outward in kind of concentric circles, and I end up with care that's paid and care institutions. So to introduce the intimate part, I'm going to read just one passage that explains the cover image. I was asked if I wanted a slide, and I'm now realizing I probably should have had a slide of the cover, but I invite you all to admire it. There's some books in the corner. But I'm just going to talk to you about what this image is and where the book gets started. And then I'm going to go to where the book ends up. And hopefully in the discussion, we can get to some of the stuff that's in between. So the image on the cover of this book, a photo of Janine and Toni's umbilical from 2000, reflects aptly on the complexities of mothering care. Its title evokes the biological connection between a fetus and the maternal body, but its form bespeaks the more mediated relationship between a child and a maternal figure. The sculpture is a spoon cast from the artist's family silverware. I'm trying to hold it up so you can see it a little bit, with an impression of her own mouth at the bowl, the inside of her mother's hand at the handle. As an object, it captures a moment of relation and fixes it in place. Mother and child, hand and mouth, flesh and metal. Umbilical suggests that care is a social practice and a physiological necessity, an intimate bodily relationship that is also always mediated by culture. I appreciate that Toni focuses on the spoon, which is typically the first utensil used in feeding, but has also become a potent metaphor for the limited energy possessed by some people who are ill or disabled. Although Toni's sculpture was cast before Christine Miserandino wrote her contagious 2003 essay, Spoon Theory, the concept adds resonance to an artwork that has everything to do with embodiment, sustenance, and the uneven distribution of dependency and care. Umbilical thus crystallizes this book's intention to approach care as a form of embodied labor that is at once fundamental and mediated, a relation that can be intimate and sustaining, but also a source of oppression and constraint. So that's where I start. I actually came to this image very late in the publication process. I see my editor, Phil, there, and he knows it was kind of a race to find an image for the cover, but I really love it now. And I love how this artwork turns a utilitarian object like a spoon into art that prods us to think more about how, when, and where we offer or accept care. But I also go on to be critical of making mothers the origin and or the center of our narratives of care. I think about the burden this puts on actual mothers, how it devalues other people who do essential care work, and sometimes essentializes women as naturally predisposed to be caring. So my goal throughout the book is to constantly underscore the vital importance of care, but also to trouble it and to denaturalize its work. So I think it's very important to talk about money and to talk about care outside of the home. So I end the book by looking to institutions of care, which I see, and I can talk more about this in the discussion, or maybe some of my panelists will have something to say about it. But part of my argument is that institutions are absolutely necessary to a modern and just society. I realize this sounds kind of retrograde given what we all know about institutions of care. But the problem is not that we have institutions that remove care from home and family. It's actually that they very rarely work well. They're just so bad. So I talk about the many ways that institutions fail, but I also look to narrative for some of the surprising ways that they succeed. And I wonder if we could build out from that. And then I will just mention the very end of the book, which I love to talk about. It's a coda about care robots. And back to my son, who's sort of my constant inspiration in my scholarly work. The chapter is inspired by my son's very intimate and caring relationships with things, and especially things that talk and do things. And so it got me thinking about care robots. At the time I started thinking about this end to the book, care robots were really having a moment because it was the full flourishing of the COVID pandemic. And especially in Asia, there were all kinds of creative uses of care robots to help humans in the very difficult work of caring for many dangerously infectious people. So I wanted to take that seriously and to think about, I think on the face of it, especially we Americans who are sort of anti-robot in many ways, think that it sounds like the worst thing in the world to be cared for or to have a loved one cared for by a robot. So I look into the many ways that robots are being used, their affective possibilities, the possibilities of affective relationships between human subjects and robots, and how we might enlist them in the future where care might be distributed more justly. So I look forward to talking about that and all kinds of other things more at the end of the panel, but I think I will leave things there for now.
Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak about your incredibly ambitious book, which does many things, including attending to the praxis of care as a framework for exploring relationality in our time. This is an urgent concern that reverberates across scale, care for other human beings, for our communities, for the world, and for the planet. It's a testament to Adam's ethos of care that she has written this book, and I hope my brief remarks respond in kind. In Adam's book, we think with her about the conceptual and practical dimensions of care as conveyed by narrative, which she defines as an account of change over time. But unlike history, which purports the same, narrative's temporalities change, unfolding into the speculative and the future and future perfect tense of what will or could have been. What will or could have been if we think with Adams across the many scenes and sights offered in this text between mothers and daughters, siblings and elderly parents, between caregivers paid and unpaid in homes and institutions, and the recipients of care, which is everyone. What does the book and the method by which these stories are told convey about the harms of relegating care to the un and underthought? How might care attend to the atrophying apathy that accompanies living in a time of pandemics, ecological catastrophe, war, and other forms of state and environmental debilitation? During the quarantine period of COVID, I took the opportunity of redesigning a course on feminist theory to exclusively focus on feminist approaches to care. Over Zoom, my students would log in, many of them from their childhood bedrooms, to discuss the assigned readings. I wish I had this book then, but we were able to read some of the authors referenced: Toni Morrison, Christina Crosby, and Audre Lorde, to name a few. These narratives facilitated conversations about the difficulties and pleasures of caregiving, the conditions under which care is sought and received, the variable and variegated factors that contribute to greater dependency, the multiple realities of disability and debility, and the feminist imperative of mutual aid. If I knew then what I have come to realize through encountering this book, is that as an educator, I wanted them to critically reflect on a transitional world for which there is no return. The present is contingent, and the forecast is more of the same. The third of 14 prefatory axioms on care begins as following in Love, Money, Duty. Quote, care is a relationship that is usually asymmetrical and may be non-reciprocal. Care can be an activity, a feeling, or an ethic, but it is always relational and rarely equivalent, end quote. Perhaps I'm drawn to this axiom because it so subtly and devastatingly characterizes relating across difference, where usually asymmetrical reveals so much about the connective tissue between love, money, and duty as the predicates of care. What is love as an activity, money as a feeling, duty as an ethic, and how might we think alongside Adams to pursue these questions? My great-grandmother, grandfather, and cousin were all amputees, and I have many childhood memories of caring for and being cared for by them. Between the ages of 10 to 12, I became a regular member of my great-grandmother's care team, which also included my grand aunt, grandmother, and another cousin. I recall my great-grandmother asking about her lost limb or screaming out in pain, but what I don't remember is whether she was satisfied with my care. I can't imagine it was particularly good. Or how familial bonds strained to meet the chasm of her needs and the state's offerings in the late 80s, early 90s, South Carolina. Or how my being sent over to take care of her was also a pretense for her being able to watch over me. These questions did not occur to me as a child, but these scenes of uneven interdependency between a child and their physically disabled family members becomes newly articulable to me in following Adams' approach to the domestic sphere as a key site for deciphering the dynamics of care, always relational and rarely equivalent. Good books offer insight on a given phenomenon. Great books offer new ways of understanding the world. Love, Money, Duty, stories of care in our times makes a critically important intervention in a most unassuming way. Care remaps the coordinates of our time. That is, and I'm also thinking with Kara Keeling's work here, that if our time is marked by quotidian violence, then care, which is neither sentimental nor mystified, produces a way of thinking about the perhaps equally mundane distribution of response. Imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and biopower condition the circuits of who can afford care, which is itself a stratified condition. Of the numerous narratives of paid caregiving, most often performed by women of color who spend their days caring for their employers' dependent loved ones, sometimes at the expense of their own, Adams offers ways to rethink care along the axes of love, money, and duty. As she notes, paying for care and caring for work contains a timely paradox. Here, time mediates the affective and material, which is perhaps most evident when money is exchanged, but the production of value is always part of the calculus. The 14th of the 14 axioms ends with the following sentence. Care has the potential to upend the values, norms, and practices that govern capitalism and our modern social and political systems. How would a universal acknowledgement of interdependency and the need for care precipitate such a shift? The significance compounds when we think about this in terms of care as an ordinary and mundane practice. In a time of exponentializing violence and harm, Adams' work reminds us that our political praxis must be related to questions of care. What does it mean to care more, to care differently? When I was co-editor of GLQ, my term ended June of 2025, the flagship journal of queer studies in the US, we created Q2, a new feature to address current events of queer political relevance. The first publication under the new heading was a transcribed conversation between Andrea Ritchie, Emily Pluma, and Sarah Haley. In the wake of the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, we asked Black abolitionist feminists to put the significance of that decision in context. Questions about care were central to the conversation, so much so we toyed with naming the piece "Criminalization is the Antidote to Care," a riff on Saidiya Hartman's "Care is the Antidote to Violence," meant to highlight how criminality was care's institutional foil and to draw a continuity between the reversal of Roe versus Wade and a broader carceral state apparatus. We eventually went with a different title to avoid potential misreadings, but this small anecdote underscores care's revolutionary potential. Greater attention to deficits and surplus of care produces different attunements to capitalism's production of value and the concomitant making of difference. This is not to say that care is a pathway to utopia. Rather, care might act as an interminable force that produces a sense of duty, a different sense of duty in the heterotopias in which we find ourselves. What is our duty of care in a debilitating world? The narratives Adams offers prepares us for the world we already inhabit and for the futures we care to co-create. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful opportunity to read and discuss your book. And so in this book, care is really thought quite broadly as the intimate and necessary labor to sustain those who are dependent. And I really appreciate how we see care through so many different lenses, right? Through the care of mothers, siblings, lovers, friends, and paid care workers, as well as from those receiving care. And through her analysis of narratives, I think that Adams beautifully and at times heartbreakingly shows the mixed emotions that accompany care. We see love, gratitude, and affection, along with frustration, anger, and protest. Mothers love their dependent child, but can also feel deeply frustrated and exhausted by care work. Domestic workers are paid for their labor, a cash nexus, but also feel deep emotions towards their charge and over the course of their relationship. And throughout reading this book, I really appreciated how Adams draws readers into the lives of care workers and those cared for, showing us how there's no singular story and no singular emotion that captures care. So in reading, there were also a few questions that I would love to kind of explore in our discussion. So one, I think you're already getting at, which is around the issue of institutions and deinstitutionalization. And I found myself really curious about your thoughts on the deinstitutionalization of care. Right, so we do have a chapter on institutions that comes at the very end or towards the very end of the book, but the context of deinstitutionalization felt everywhere. Right, we were reading about care that often takes place at the home, that is done by family or done by paid domestic workers. And so while deinstitutionalization was a response often to abusive environments, we also see that this rehoming project was hardly perfect. As the book shows, home-based care can be fraught with tensions. We hear narratives of family members who are exhausted, of homes scattered with medical materials, of workers who are often undervalued for their labor. And so I feel like you have a critique or a nuanced take on the deinstitutionalization of care. And I wonder if you might want to say a little bit more about what you think, or if there's a larger argument that the book might be making about rehoming. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I now understand that your argument that institutions are necessary, but they often fail. So I'd be curious to hear you perhaps imagine as to how you would see potentially institutions acting in a more positive way of care. Another thing that really stood out to me was gender, of course, a main theme throughout the book. So there's obviously a gendered component to care. Care work is often done by women, paid or unpaid, and that's probably clear to everyone in this room. But at the same time, I feel like your book is offering a more nuanced gendered analysis. So for example, in the chapter on HIV, we see care between men, friends, chosen families. In the chapter on siblings, we also see care between brothers, like between Noah and Henry. And so while there is a societal norm of women as caretakers, I also think that your book offers some nuance. So I'm curious to hear you reflect perhaps on, under what conditions is care not gendered as feminine? Are male caretakers different in their work, in their relationship, or emotional labor? And thinking about your chapter on motherhood, as mothers are caring, what exactly are the fathers doing? And how does each parent make sense of their gendered role in caregiving? A third point, and this is, I think, where my sociology probably shows quite strongly. So I'm a bit of an outsider to the method. And so I'm curious about the kind of analytical choices made in this book. And in particular, so some of the choices, reading about memoirs or biography feels a little bit more familiar to me as a sociologist. It's a bit reminiscent of autoethnography. And then there's also analysis of fiction, which is more distant and less familiar to me. So I'm curious, what do these different kinds of texts give us? What do they reveal for us? What might they conceal? So one example, thinking about mothering, is, why choose Morrison's Beloved and not Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which I know is a father. But thinking about the choice of fiction, right, though based on real events here, versus personal narrative, and also the choice of time, in this case, between the past exploitations of slavery and more present-day racism and racial violence that threaten Black lives. And of course, history is connected to the present context, but analytically, right, the kind of choices between fiction and personal narrative, and between texts of past context and present day. And then finally, the concept of slow emergencies. So the concept of slow emergency really came out in the chapter on dementia. And one aspect of this concept is how it highlights the long durée of time. And this is really kind of drawn out in the form of care of someone in decline at the end of life. But slow emergencies are also characterized by attritional lethality, imperceptibility, and foreclosed action. And slow emergencies are often described by political actors as unfortunate conditions without acknowledging how those conditions were produced or proposing tangible solutions to address them. So for instance, with COVID-19, political leaders in the US acknowledged the structural effects of racism in producing unequal health outcomes, while also claiming that there was nothing to be done to address it. And so health disparities were framed as an intransigent historical truth rather than a problem caused by policies that could be countered. And so the concept of slow emergency is also pushing us to uncover how conditions were produced, and in so doing, allow us to see that there can be policies and actions to counter them. So I wonder if we can also think about the book through the lens of slow emergency. Have the conditions of care work in the US become a slow emergency, one where we tend to see home-based labor, stressed family members, and low-paid migrant workers as the norm, that while unfortunate, is the only way we could possibly provide care for those who need it, right? How did we get here? How were those conditions produced? How did we arrive at a situation where paid care workers become, as you mentioned, secondary dependents, dependent through lowly associations, through meager wages, and the dangers of their work, right? Or how did we arrive at a rehoming situation where mothers are struggling to juggle their insurance claims, daily care provision, as well as their own work that enables them to pay for care workers? And in understanding the political decisions that got us to these care arrangements, what kinds of policies or actions do you think might be needed to address the problems that we're seeing? So thank you so much for this book.
Hello? All right. Good. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. And apparently I write books, but I cannot read my emails. So I didn't get the memo that I was supposed to talk for 5 to 8 minutes. So I'm going to be a little free thing here. And so there we go. Just manage your expectations. So I came to this book. So I kind of call myself a recovering sociologist because I was trained as a social scientist, but every time I read sociology, I'm like, I can't deal with this. And then I became a nonfiction writer with my forthcoming book and has memoir in it as well.
And so when I was reading this book, I'm reading it as both going, well, stories, yes, I tell stories. So I'm looking at your stories almost like data for me to sort of confirm the ways that I came to the stories I tell in the book In Sickness and in Health, right? So it was great for me to sort of see these stories and be like, yes, we're on track. Like, this is what I saw, some of these very similar themes, and thinking about the stories that you were telling, and also thinking about like that you were telling both of your own, which those were my favorite bits, by the way, was your memoir like threaded within. So I just want you to know that. And then thinking about the beginning of your book, you said that you focus on stories because we have a lack of imagination about care, and that stories are a place to find that imagination. I think that was your framing at the beginning. And I thought about that a lot because I was thinking about, in some ways, I don't think we lack imagination. I think we have a very deliberate imagination of what care and disability in particular mean and what that can look like. I think we have a very purposeful, eugenic vision of what that is. I don't think there's a lack of imagination. I think there's a really bad imagination that is bound up in the histories and current state of white supremacy, ableism, and sexism at that nexus. And that sexism is what makes us depend on women and make women think that they should be the person to be dependent on to carry the weight of an absent system of state abandonment. That's a key part of fascism, is to have women at home so they can't be out in public, right? And then the white supremacy and the ableism, that is absolutely the two pillars of eugenics, this sort of constant search for an able-bodied white public, as it were. And if those quote unquote, those people, disabled people in particular, and caregivers, we abandon disabled people, and therefore we abandon the people who care for them. So that our abandonment as caregivers is a product of the abandonment of disabled people, generally speaking. So when I was thinking about these stories, I was thinking, okay, you're traveling this really variable spaces with different roles, from siblings to mothers to, children of aging parents to partners to, and on and on. But the thread in all of those, to me, is the devaluation of people who need care. And that devaluation is what drives the invisibility and the abandonment of both the people that need care and those that then are left to care for them, because we've decided that certain people aren't worth our public investment, right? And so there is the thread, I think. And one of the things that was, as I was reading, was like, this is so capacious in terms of how many different kinds of relationships, different kinds of impairments, just different, and that impairment difference matters, and that onset, either through birth or later, that all that matters. And so I guess what I'm saying is I was searching for that like thread through everything. Like, could I figure out some sort of unifying theme? And that's what I was thinking about. And so I'm a little scattered, but I'm working on it. The question that, well, I had a couple of questions, but one of them was, when we abandon people who need care and therefore abandon the caregivers, they become the one to shoulder. And we're looking at their stories, and I'm thinking to myself, how unfair to expect caregiver stories to sort of, yes, there's imagination in what they're going through. And I think I love the parts in particular about like feces and urination, about just being like talking about it with aplomb, like just, it's it's fine. It's what we do. It's our bodies. Like, this is what it is. But how impossible it is oftentimes, and I think it's the point, for disabled people and people who are abandoned to care for them, to imagine otherwise under such constraints. Just is a tall order, but it's something that I suppose I want us all to do. I also had a question about, because you went into feminist philosophy for a little bit, and I was like, okay, so I'm thinking about this word reciprocity, which came up a lot. And I was trying to think about, what does that mean? What does that mean to think about relationships as reciprocal? In other words, are we supposed to mirror each other and do exactly the same thing that somebody else does for me? Or are there differences in the ways that we contribute that are only, there are many times we said it's not reciprocated. You know, these are unequal relationships and people aren't reciprocating. But I just wonder, what does that even mean to think about reciprocity? And can we be more expansive with our imagination of what reciprocity might look like? Okay, maybe I'll be quiet now. I guess all this to say is that one of the reasons that caregiving and talking about caregiving is so important right now in this moment is that we're living in the continued eugenic project that has been the United States. And I think we have to talk about care because that is the site at which everything sort of comes undone because we all need it. And so this sort of eugenic dream, you know, fever dream can sort of be punctured with this idea that we all need care. And I have to believe that if we talk about caregiving, maybe we're enacting more care towards each other, and that the more care we enact towards each other, the less likely people will be prone to grievance. That if people have the care they need, the less sort of tempting it is to spend your time harming others. So for that, I thank you for a conversation on care. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, now I'm supposed to respond to all. I'm completely overwhelmed. All right, I think I'll respond to maybe one thing from each of you, but first of all, I just want to thank you all for your generosity. I've so appreciated your comments and questions, and you've reminded me of so many things that I forgot to say on my own book. So there's so much to talk about here. I guess I'm just going to start with Laura and say, I mean, I guess I'm kind of retrograde. I don't actually think this is eugenic nation. I know we invented eugenics, and I have, you know, lots of things that are very critical to say about the country that we live in today and its history. But there is sort of an extended plea throughout the book for the welfare state, and that we actually try to make it better and not that we throw it out altogether. And so it is important to me to remember that there were times in our history when the state took a more active role in caring for its citizens. It certainly didn't care for everybody, and it often had restrictions on that care that made it inaccessible to the people who needed it most. But I don't want to let the state off the hook. And so that's one of my problems with a lot of the conversations about care that look to sort of grassroots and mutual aid organizations for answers. I think the world of the work that some of those organizations are doing, but I also just don't think it's right to look to them for the answers. Like we need a government that actually works and that sees caring for its people as part of its fundamental mission. I also want to argue back a little bit against the idea that that eugenics is everybody's imagination is different, and the culture, if you're going to talk about something called the cultural imagination, that's something extremely diverse and varied. How can we ask people who are exhausted by giving care and trying to get the care that they need to then tell stories that help us reimagine? Well, they have been. And so my work has been to try to collect those stories. So I do think the counter narratives are there. And one of the sort of profound lessons that I learned from doing the work on this book is that when we live or spend extended amounts of time in proximity to people who are dependent, I certainly go for the people who find values in those kinds of exchanges. And those are the imaginations that I'm trying to take as my guides as I find my way through this project. So I certainly, I don't want to discount the terrifying visions that you brought up, but also I guess I go for the alternatives.
Well, I think that eugenics is the reason why we have poor long-term care infrastructure in this country and we don't have universal care. In other words, I want the state to take all of that up, but I think eugenics has been the barrier because we only deem certain people deserving of it. And so I'm not at all saying the state should be not a part of it. Yeah.
So I guess at bottom for me, and I'm a literary critic, and that's why I go to stories. And my editor really helped me to think about ways to rein in the claims that I made in the book about their revolutionary power. But I do think stories help us to reimagine, and that's the fundamental problem, is that we need to learn how to think differently about people who are dependent and the people who take care of them. Okay, so just to go to Amy, you had so many wonderful questions, and I'm trying to think of which one I might answer the most productively. All right, well, I will just say about, you had a question about my archive, like how I came to choose some texts and not others. Very haphazard. Through, I had questions that I was asking and I read. I mean, really, once you start to think through the lens of care, which is, in many ways, the most fundamental human need, it's everywhere in everything we read. And so, I was searching for narratives that were helping me to answer the questions that I was asking about. And I also was looking for narratives that were representing voices that don't always get heard in the dominant conversations. So that's one reason you asked, like, why did I go to Toni Morrison and not Ta-Nehisi Coates? Well, one thing that fiction does is it invents stories when we don't have them. And so it can give voice to people and problems that are not articulated in the historical record. And so I think that's one thing that Morrison's novel does very powerfully. I also just in that chapter, just the practical organizing topic was about mothers in situations that I describe as extreme parenting. So mothers taking care of children who seem, almost impossible to care for one reason or another. And so, so Morrison's novel fit with that theme, whereas Coates is talking about, caring for a typical child in, the exceptional, unfortunately, the all too predictable circumstances of living in a racist society. So, but I would love to think more about Coates. Okay, last thing, I will just respond to one thing that Riley said. In that very eloquent response, which I'm so grateful to have all these notes. I'm going to keep thinking about them for a long time afterwards. But Riley brought up the theme of time and temporality, and the word time is in my title. But I often forget to talk about the fact that the time and temporality are a running theme throughout the project. I do think that care, again, I'll just reiterate, is like the most fundamental activity of all of our lives. Most of us are either getting it or receiving it every day. And yet it runs on temporalities that are really inimical to the ones that govern our life in capitalist modernity. So care is, sometimes it's productive, when we raise a child who then go out into the world and like goes to college and makes a lot of money. I don't know, but rarely is it productive in the ways that we imagine it to be. It rarely lines up with, billable hours or a time card. And it's very rarely profitable. When we do seek to profit from care, that's when we get really, really bad institutions. And so often care makes demands on us that require expenditures of time that are absolutely other to the dominant schedules that govern our lives. And that's why some, I do think those temporalities have very radical possibilities. But in our daily lives, often they work to hamper and frustrate us. And so somewhere in between, I'm writing a lot of these chapters and I'm thinking about the different temporalities that go with different kinds of caregiving. And then we haven't talked about aesthetics at all. So I'm a literary critic and I'm actually very interested in the aesthetic choices that authors and artists make to try to attune us to those atypical temporalities. So happy to talk about more of those if you're interested. I think I will stop there and now we have discussion, right? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Curious to hear from others.
I'm going to repress my own instinct to ask a question that jumps off exactly where you were just there, Rachel, but maybe I'll ask you later on. Let's open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. So please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question of Rachel or one of the panelists. Yes, thank you.
Oh my God.
Raise your hand and please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Yes. Okay, my name is Chanel and I'm a third year in English, like PhD student. And a lot of the words used, I'm really interested in the memoir genre and how you've written it to explore care. Like the words used to introduce your book were honest, intimate, sincere, candid, vulnerable, and then we have words like heartbreaking. And so my question is, Rachel, what were the kind of practices that you did in the writing of this book to kind of mitigate the emotional or affective load of writing such a heavy book, as well as still caregiving at the same time?
Oh, what a lovely, caring question, Chanel. I really appreciate that. Through a lot of this book, it was COVID, and I was just losing my mind. And I will say, I think my mind goes to the difficult places. Like that's what I like to think about. Often I don't want to be in those places myself. So my happy place is getting to write about those issues. I actually think in some ways I'm like an extremely anxious and, often apocalyptically minded person. And I think maybe I have some kind of magical thinking where I think that if I could just anticipate all of this bad stuff that's going to happen and like sort of write critically about it, then maybe I will not be surprised when it happens to me. But it was incredibly difficult, and the pandemic and a number of other events that I write about in this book, including like the death of a couple of parents and friends and some very difficult caregiving situations. All of those were going on, and I do try to build those into the narrative. And there was something about knowing that I could tell the stories of them and make meaning out of them that helped me to get through. I mean, I'm not recommending this as a long-term strategy, but I do write about, like, for example, sitting by my father's bedside. My father was dying under like very non-ideal conditions. And I was so hot and I was so uncomfortable, and I knew I should be like attuned to him, but I desperately just wanted to be anywhere other than that. And so I occupied myself by thinking about like someday this will be over and I will be able to sit with my computer by myself and make meaning out of this experience. And so having had the opportunity to do that and then to share with all of you is, I find extremely salutary. So thank you for asking.
Lindsay.
This is sort of a follow-up to what Chanel said, which is when you're like, oftentimes I think caregivers feel very isolated and alone and don't feel that the people around them understand what they're doing or the weight of it. And I'm wondering if in your making meaning, what you're describing is you're taking it and making meaning for yourself. And I'm wondering, how did that affect the people whose stories you're telling? Do you think that it also helped them put a frame around what they're experiencing so that they felt more meaning from it and less isolation?
Thank you for that question. So I should say, so I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not actually collecting. There are a few people that I talk to, like some family friends, and I share their stories. But people whose stories that I am analyzing here they're already digested. And I think I like to think that the authors have found something very meaningful in that opportunity. I also found it extremely reassuring and a great kind of mental and emotional resource to have those stories available to me. So, for the book, I just thought of myself as a collector, like I'm going to make this big archive, but then I'm also going to try to build additional meaning out of it. One thing I do find is that when I share this book, it brings out, like either during the discussion or afterward, people come up to me, they recognize themselves in some story that's been told in the book, and then they want to share their own stories. And they find something very, like, I've never told anyone this before, but I have this aunt that I have to care for, and it's such a burden. I love her. So that's been unexpected and very interesting. I don't think, releasing people to tell their difficult stories again is like the path to a more just society. But it does seem like valuable work. on some level. So the telling and having people there to listen to your story, because like you said, it's often very lonely.
Yeah, it may not be the path to a just society, but it's difficult to imagine a just society in which people weren't free to tell their stories. Carlos.
Well, thank you everybody for these really wonderful responses to Rachel's wonderful book. As someone prone to unwieldy concepts, I appreciate the specificity of defining care as putting somebody in position to a dependent person who wouldn't be able to survive without it. Yet at the same time, and it seems like this is a common response, I'm struck by the ways that type of care intersects with other types of care or carelessness, such that even your opening example, umbilical, features not just any spoon, but a piece of sort of collectible silverware, something that in many families people have cared for, in an intergenerational scale, yet that, for reasons related to kind of commodity flows that I can't track, this type of silverware that people have cared for is something that no one cares about anymore. Like it's not worth anything except for the silver. So I'm curious, even if in the cover of the book, the care that you're most interested in intersects with other types of care. Can you tell us about an example of such an intersection that maybe you felt like was taking your book in a different direction, or a sort of path that you didn't go down in order to focus on, the far too numerous examples that you already have at your disposal with your concept, or maybe just some moment in which different types of care are in friction?
Thank you. What a wonderful, provocative question that I need to think about further. I describe the spoon as ordinary, but of course, in being part of the family silver, it does speak to the kind of family that it comes from, and it's not an ordinary spoon. But okay, so yes, so care, as I suggested and you suggested, it kind of means everything and anything, and especially the way it's used in criticism these days. Sometimes in ways that are very important. I talk a little bit about self-care in the introduction and why I don't go there. I think self-care can be, and I talk about how care is has no politics, but it can very easily be politicized. So self-care is an interesting one because on the one hand, self-care is often used by the most selfish, entitled people you can imagine as an excuse for them really not to care about anyone. There was an article in the New York Times in the last few weeks about, it was like this study that shows yoga does not make people more caring. But I really like yoga myself, but it has all these claims to kind of make you better toward the world and you. At the same time, self-care is often used by many people who are like community organizers and advocates as a way of carving out like some kind of space to ensure that they have like the well-being and respite to continue the work that they're doing. So that's, and there's like a famous Audre Lorde poster that I talk about in the book that does, I can't remember exactly what she says, but it's about self-care. So those, I feel like there's probably better examples beyond that, but okay, here's one more that's dear to your heart, is care for the environment. And, that's somewhere I was going constantly in the book because, our house is on fire. And so even as we try to figure out the problems with human care, we are dealing with the consequences of a very uncaring attitude toward our environment that is forcing a reckoning sooner than anyone thought. I was often tempted to get swept away in thinking about what it would mean to care for all kinds of lives beyond the human. And I've actually written about that, relationships with animals and plants and the built environment. But I don't go there in this book because there just wasn't room for it. So I wrote an article I'll share with you if you're interested. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, over there in the front row.
Hi, Rachel. My name's Carolyn. I'm a museum educator. And you wound up your initial remarks with a comment about aesthetics and how you were looking at it, aesthetic choices that writers might make in this discussion. And for a moment, I thought you were going to go towards the aesthetics of care. And I wonder if you've given any thought to that. And I haven't read the book yet, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I so appreciate that question. I am very interested in the aesthetics of care. I'm a very negative person. I tend to go toward the negative and to seek out examples where care produces bad feelings, where care fails. But I do also have this theme that at some point was going to be like, I think it was actually in one of the many bad titles that I came up with, which was about artful caregivers. And those people are sort of my heroes throughout the book. And I do look for these people who, there are interdependencies between people who care for one another, or a dependent person and a caregiver. I do think there are people who either possess a wisdom or develop a wisdom, and that care becomes an aesthetic act. There's like a grace to it, a completion. At the same time that care, as I think it was Riley who pointed out, I'm very concerned with asymmetry. And I think we need to recognize that care is always asymmetrical. So it never is going to meet, classical models of beauty. But so I am always looking for artful caregivers and to describe the way that care works. But then I'm also interested in how trying to represent care might shape different kinds of aesthetic projects. So I'm trying to think about one of my, I think this is not talked about in my book, but when I went to see this Janine and Toni spoon, there was also a video installation that she had made in that exhibit. And she had painted her hair like brown, and then she was mopping a floor with it. And I thought, well, this is not actually really a representation of the kinds of care that I write about, which is for dependent people, but it is certainly an aestheticization of sort of care for the home, and the way that people often, identified people are asked to do this redundant, tedious, often dirty work that normally is invisible, of caring for the home and keeping it clean. And here she is staining the floor with her labors. So there's all kinds of examples like that in the book, where I look at the way that people are sort of using aesthetic forms to make us aware of care relations, and in particular the strange temporalities of care. So I'm going to think of more examples as soon as I'm done talking, but that's the best one I could think of.
You have time for more questions. May.
Yeah, hi. I'm Marie Lee, and I am a novelist, but I'm also a parent of a disabled person who lives at home. And I was just going to ask you about if you have any, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm kind of curious about the ideas of like the perverse incentives when we're talking about institutionalization, because for instance, it was Reagan who signed the Katie Beckett waiver into law, for which the burden, the economic burden to some degree, was put on the parents to care for children who would otherwise be institutionalized. But what we see now with Trump, and it's only more distinctive, it's not like this hasn't been a trend. And also I write about late stage capitalism in my novel because that's so interesting to me as a parent. So why is it now in particular that they're trying to cut all these programs with Medicaid, where actually the government's getting the big deal because parents like us have to do the work through these programs? I don't know if you have any commentary on that, because it's just like the perverse incentives of it, like is so fascinating to me. And it's not that it's just Trump, it's been this way through other administrations. Like these programs have been slowly being cut. I see you like nodding your head, like if you know, I didn't want to get too granular about it, but it's just something that I'm just always looking at going, this doesn't make any sense at all. And it's incredibly mean, basically. It's incredibly cruel to disabled people.
It is, and that's where the love in the title comes in, because there's this idea that, you know, if you love your child, you're going to do the work, whether we pay for it or not. It's absolutely shit. I mean, Amy asked about deinstitutionalization. The problem with deinstitutionalization is that the institutions were closed and money to go into communities to pay for. It wasn't that there was going to be less care for people who were dependent. It was that it would be distributed, and the institutions were closed and people were sent out into the streets, and the money never came, and the money has never been adequate. And of course, you would agree the money that is there goes to the people who are best equipped to argue for it. So often not to those who need it most. And so deinstitutionalization is a failed experiment. Now, what institutions do well is that I do highlight in the book various situations is actually unhealthy for families or for dependent people. They be cared for by family members, and sometimes the family members actually, you know, exacerbate the problems. And so we need places where we can be cared for by others who are not families. And when we turn it back on families, what happens? The work goes back to color hired to do the work for them. So do I have the answer to this problem? No, but I absolutely agree with you about the outrage and the hypocrisy of people who say they stand for family and traditional values. Also, cutting the budgets of our care providers is it's an absurd hypocrisy. So thanks for bringing it up.
I think we have time for one remaining question, either from the audience or from one of our panelists. All right, then I am going to ask the question that I didn't ask earlier, which is, I'm interested, you were talking about this a little bit, Rachel, which is there's a series of phrases that come up in the book: reading for care, the idea of critical care. There's this beautiful phrase, the art of interdependence, which you were alluding to a second ago. A moment ago, you mentioned artful caregivers, an instance of artful care. I'm interested, I don't really have a question here, so much of surprise, so much as I'm interested in the relationship between the way that you think of narrative and story as a resource for thinking through critically about all the dimensions of care. And that's one important part of the book. But the other is this thing which is partly, I think, methodological, but I think it's also attitudinal, right? It's about a kind of sensibility or orientation towards your objects, in which you want to read them carefully and then in them find instances of the same care that you're bringing to them. Does that make sense? So I'm interested in the relationship between what you think of as the artfulness of care and your attention to the artfulness of your examples as a critic.
Oh, that's a very good question. I think you're asking in a gracious way. I feel like the sociologists were politely suggesting that I don't really have what they would describe as a method. And I think they're right. You know, I'm somewhat essayistic. I read a lot of theory. I try to write, theoretically and to be historically informed. But I also kind of just go where my ideas take me. And so I do want to have it all. I do want to read care. I want to read care. I want to read care in the narratives that I'm reading. That does mean certain things. So I think often caregivers are in narrative in the same way they are in life marginalized. And so sometimes it means reading for minor characters and trying to figure out what they might be thinking or doing or how they are more important to the narrative than it might seem on first read. But I also think that narratives are, like I was suggesting about Toni Morrison, a valuable resource for finding voices that aren't otherwise represented. And so sometimes they do, the caregiver or the I have a whole chapter on dependent people speaking for themselves about what it means to rely on other people's care for your life. So I guess I just want to say it does all of those things. And maybe I'm going to end it.